I'd like to welcome everybody to our first Civility from the summer. After the summer, we're thrilled that you're all here and delighted to have such a wonderful speaker. We do this series in cooperation with Hearst Media and the Dylan Schneider Group, and we're delighted to have them as partners. Oh, the mic is not, I think I'm probably just too far away. Okay. What I just want to do is remind you to silence your cell phones, please, and then I will hand it over to Janet from Dylan Schneider Group, who will introduce our guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. And good evening, everybody. We're thrilled to have everybody back from the season. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the first evening of our 6th season. Either I can't see you or I can't see my notes, I'm sorry. It's that age. I hope you all had a great summer, and we're really thrilled to have everybody back for the new season. We're fortunate tonight to be able to launch the fall season with such an esteemed speaker as Richard Edlin. He's the leading litigator and vice chairman of the Greenberg Traurig law firm. He'll speak to us tonight about civility and the law. It used to be that putting civility and the law in the same sentence was like an oxymoron. And I say that with the utmost respect because I lived with an attorney for 30 years, so I understand it. But today it seems like life is imitating the courtroom, with uncivil behavior permeating everything from the news to the government to the courts to the sports and local communities. Every time we turn on the news, somebody somewhere in the world is inciting unrest, with a focus on civility as outdated as yesterday's news. The rules of diplomacy and negotiation are being rewritten, and without getting political, starting at the top and threatening to undermine the core of our legal system. As Rich will point out in his speech, America's raison d'etre is completely entwined in the judicial system. It's what separates the U.S. from dictatorships and the tyranny of lawless frontiers. It's the reason that refugees have been coming to America for years and years from all corners of the world. As a lawyer and a litigator, Rich has learned the art of agreeing to disagree. In the legal world, where the concept of dispute puts civility in a different light, Rich will share insights on the current status of the legal system and how current events are challenging the very core of the courts. He brings an interesting perspective on how the law is the bedrock of our democracy and our ability to deal with today's contentious issues within the framework of our constitutional system is under threat because the integrity of the judicial branch is under attack. Mr. Edlin is a vice chairman and chair of the litigation practice in New York for Greenberg Traurig, one of the leading firms in the world. The firm has more than 2,400 attorneys, employees in 38 countries, including the U.S., Latin America, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and is currently celebrating its 50th anniversary. Rich is a frequent lecturer on litigation strategy, and he's the author of Courtroom Strategies for Litigation Success. He has been widely recognized as a leading litigator by numerous professional publications, including Chambers and Partners, Law Dragon, Legal 500, and Martindale Hubbell. We are privileged to have him here tonight as our first speaker. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Rich Edlin.
Well, thank you, Janet, for that great opportunity, the great introduction, and the opportunity to be here with all of you. It's an incredible facility here, and it's an honor to be here with the Dylan Schneider Group and Hearst. And, in keeping with prior speakers, they really were looking for a distinguished lawyer that had a background in politics, in the law, in the courtroom, someone who had worked with the legislature, the judicial branch. That person was unavailable this evening, so, and getting this talk ready has been a bit of a challenge. We were supposed to be here in March. There was a snowstorm, and every time the president tweets, you could have a new lecture. So we'll try to keep it topical, and I hope that the Q&A will bring up anything that people want to talk about, perhaps with the NFL or anything else. But this is a talk about civility and the law. Not about politics and society per se, But since the law winds a path through all of this, as well as other things, it's inevitable that my comments are going to touch on a variety of these topics. Please don't take anything that I say as political. Please don't take anything, as I say, as a judgment of anything. That's not my task, but I hope that when we're done, you will have a few things to think about. And I'd like to begin the discussion of civility and the law by going back to the fundamentals and the basic building blocks of our nation. Because ever since the early 17th century, millions of people have come from virtually everywhere to America because they saw it as a land of opportunity. They wanted to be in a place where the law truly meant something. For others, it was a refuge. For others still, it was a shining city on a hill. But those immigrants wanted to be free of oppression by czars, by other tyrants. They wanted their homes and their farms and their businesses protected from arbitrary seizures, and they wanted the rights of individuals upheld. In short, they wanted a place to live where the laws were fair and fairly enforced. Now, we all know that these ideals have been frequently tested in our history. We've seen that we still have a ways to go in ensuring that our laws are fairly applied to all citizens, regardless of race, creed, sexual orientation. And we know that the strong have sometimes gained too much political and economic power and then abused it. There was one particular 19th century robber baron who was remembered for saying, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?" It represents an unfortunate, sometimes insidious tendency for the law to be bent to the will of the wealthy. Remember that the U.S. is still a relatively new country. We are still experimenting with our democracy. We're not perfect, but we are better than anything that has come before us. And this experiment deserves our full attention, our full engagement, our full commitment to the values and the laws upon which we were built. So although we've managed to restrain the abuse of power and we've kept the playing field relatively level, sometimes it took a little while to figure that out. But we've been able to do this because we are built on a series of checks and balances. Our Constitution, a legislative branch which adopts the laws, an executive branch that carries out the laws, and a judicial branch to rule on the constitutionality of those laws and the legality of the enforcement of those laws. We have a system, therefore, that has given us both stability and the capacity to make change. Although as new technologies arise, we have to reinvent our laws and attitudes to adopt. I'm thinking about police body cameras. I'm thinking about drones that seem to fly everywhere. There are now phones that can record us in all manners and we don't even know that it's happening. There are advanced technologies that can see into our homes and listen into our homes from the street or the sky above, and we need our laws to adapt to these new technologies. But we have understood for the most part that you bring about this change in the public arena, find those individuals as not persons. They were considered property, slaves were considered property, and therefore, since they were not persons, in quotes, they were not entitled to the legal protections and could never become American citizens. Now, citizenship is a category that you could debate. We could have things that you need to qualify for in order to be a citizen. But personhood is different. It sort of defines itself, doesn't it? So the law can't tell you that you're not a person, no matter what blood goes through your veins, no matter what color your skin is. And the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision was trying to do that by defining people in certain ways. Now, fortunately, it took almost just a little more than 10 years to correct the outrage of the Dred Scott decision. The United States Congress passed the 14th Amendment, which along with the 13th and the 15th were really our first civil rights act after the Civil War. 14th Amendment defines American citizens as all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Just as importantly, it declares that government may not deprive any person, of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. Let's focus on how important those first two words I mentioned are. Any person. In other words, even if you aren't a citizen, you are still protected from certain governmental abuses because you are a person. This is a law to be proud of. This is the laws, these are the laws that our country has been built on. Now, we're engaged in another great debate about the rights of personhood. This is the current debate under the heading of immigration, including the place in our country for those who are here illegally, the legality of the ban on travelers from certain Muslim countries, and the status of young people who entered this country as children of illegal aliens who we now call dreamers. It's a truly important and a long overdue debate, for we've gone too long without making necessary changes in the law. We have violent criminals and terrorists who are itching to get over our border. Cartels currently control parts of the American Southwest, and there is no American law enforcement there. We need laws to deal with that. We need laws that address those issues. But what is dangerous is that the civility that should surround this issue has been replaced with a great deal of inflammatory language and insightful action. Debate requires civility, not blame. Debate requires a discussion and not a grenade. Some categories of immigrants or would-be immigrants, especially Mexicans and Muslims, have become so vilified that certain aspects of our society, certain people in our society, have taken it as a license to engage in violence, sometimes with lethal consequences. And I'm thinking of the engineer from India who was killed in a Kansas bar because he was mistaken for a Muslim, and the Sikh in Washington State who was shot by a man shouting, "Go back to your own country," and this was a person born here. I'm thinking of individuals who were brought into this country as the children of illegal parents, legal aliens, and do we punish children for the acts of their parents? I'm not suggesting answers, but I am saying that how we go about this debate and the dialogue of this national discussion that is required to answer these questions will determine the future of this country and whether we can continue to be an example for the rest of the world, which is, after all, our historical legacy. We should not, and I will say must not, live as if the Dred Scott decision were still in effect and people who aren't citizens are deemed non-persons with no rights. That is so far from where we ought to be in the debate over immigration that it begins to erode not only the concept of civility, but of civilization itself. You cannot separate civility from the civilization in which it exists or doesn't exist. Yet another debate that often gets out of control is the one concerning abortion. Clearly, there are deep passions on this issue between those who see abortion as legalized murder and those who see it as a woman's right to choose. I'm not here to say that one side is right and one side is wrong, but I am here to say there is a right and wrong way to debate this issue. Because as intense as those passions may surely be, blowing up doctors and killing people in clinics is abhorrent and a threat to civilized society, as should be self-evident. The violence caused by the radicalization of this issue in particular only makes it harder, if not impossible, to have the discussions that are necessary for compromise. This is universally true. As another example, we know for a fact that the passions surrounding gay rights have led to gruesome violence. We must ensure that the current debate, however it is resolved, over the right of certain businesses to refuse goods and services to gay couples, what constitutes a valid marriage, We need to make sure that this plays out in our legislatures and our courts, not in dark alleys. It's very troubling, therefore, that our ability to deal with such contentious issues within the framework of our constitutional system is under threat because the integrity of the judicial branch is under attack. The judicial branch of the three branches of government is the one that is supposed to be the most impartial. It is the check and balance on the legislature passing invalid laws. It is the check and balance on the executive branch unfairly enforcing these laws. And I don't think I need to spell this out in great detail. We all know that last year a presidential candidate questioned a judge's ability to hear a case fairly because he was Mexican, a statement that was both factually wrong, politically motivated. And we also know that the same candidate, now the president, launched a similar attack on a federal judge who struck down his original ban on immigrants from Muslim-majority countries. He accused the judge of putting the country in peril and said if something happens, blame him and the court system, thus putting that judge's life and perhaps other judges' lives in danger for doing his job. We can disagree with how a person does his job, but we just can't kill him for doing his job. One could easily construe those words from the holder of the highest office in our land to mean that any terrorist attack that happens at any time in the future on American soil will be the fault of a judge and of the court system in which he works. This is the opposite of civil debate. It falls beneath the level of rational discourse among serious people on serious topics. And by the way, if you stick with that particular issue, the Supreme Court ultimately upheld aspects of the travel ban, and Trump was successful in the Supreme Court in a number of ways. So if you stick with the system and allow the system to work, it could take longer. But we are now operating within the confines of the greatest system of justice ever created, not outside of it. Now, some of you may be thinking, what's wrong with a president taking issue with a court decision? Don't lawyers do that all the time when they appeal rulings? Not to mention the way they fight with one another in court. But what happens in courtrooms is, by design, an adversarial process. The judge's role is to be the interpreter of the law and to make sure that what happens in the courtroom stays within certain guidelines. The opposing attorneys are not engaged in some idealistic search for the truth. They are there to get the best outcome for their client, period. That's what happens in courtrooms. That is obviously very different from the highest elected official in the land trying to turn public opinion against the court system. The issue is not motive. I am not suggesting that anybody in this dialogue is badly motivated, but it's the method through which it is communicated. It is the civility with which we deliver those methods that are at our core what makes this an American country and what makes this an American democracy. History teaches us that the first thing tyrants do is to try to do away with the law. The first thing they do is suspend the law. They wish to be accountable to no one. And we will never allow that in this country. We will never submit to rules of tyranny. Let me add a couple of more points about the integrity of courtroom proceedings. One is that government lawyers are actually held to a higher standard than those in private practice. In legal circles, we say that government lawyers are required to turn square corners, not cut corners. So government lawyers, if they come into possession of information that shows that a defendant is innocent, are required to bring that information forth and to stop prosecuting somebody that they know didn't commit the crime involved. So the standard of conduct for people in government is by design always higher than for the rest of us. We represent ourselves. Our government represents all of us. That's how it should be. My second point is that the only real power that judges have resides in our collective belief that when a judge makes a ruling, it's to be respected. There are no court police that fan out to enforce judicial decisions. That's never been the case in this country. So when high-ranking public officials sneer at and attack judges, they assault not only the integrity of that individual, but they shake public confidence in the entire system. People think, hey, if he can ignore the courts, so can I. Worse still, maybe the laws don't apply at all. Maybe I've got a choice of whether to comply with the law. When we start to think like that, when we start to act on that, we jeopardize everything that this country was built on, including the aspiration of those millions of immigrants that have come to this land expecting that the rules of law will apply to them as well. So I've laid out the ways, or at least some, in which civility in our nation is being threatened. But it's not just our nation. If you look around the world, we're not alone. A lot of the things that are happening here are happening in Western Europe. Great Britain's vote to leave the European Union was mostly driven by a rejection of the EU's open immigration policy. Hard-right anti-immigrant politicians are in charge in Poland, in Hungary, and they have turned the recent elections in France and in Germany into hard-fought battles. Monday's election in Germany shows the far-right AfD party with 13% of the vote. It's the strongest political presence of right-wing ideology in German government since the Nazi era. Returning the conversation to what's going on in this country, which is obviously our primary concern, I certainly don't have the answers to these subjects. But I do have some thoughts about how we can respond to current challenges. First of all, we need to care less about winning and more about honoring the institutions that have made this country great. There's a dramatic scene in the movie A Man for All Seasons, which is about the life of Sir Thomas More, that brings this point to life. More, as you may recall, was a deeply religious man who literally lost his head rather than bow to Henry VIII on the issue of divorce. It's a brilliant lawyer. And in the scene I'm thinking of, More is having a debate with his son-in-law, and his son-in-law is arguing against strict adherence to legal procedures, saying he would cut down every law that he could find in order to get at the devil. And More replies, oh, and when the last law was down and the devil turned round on you, where would you hide, the laws all being flat? Do you really think you could stand upright in the winds that would blow then? Do you really think you can stand upright in the winds that would blow then? Powerful issues beget powerful consequences. And that's the thought we must all hold on to now. Yes, we want our side to win the great debates that mark our time, but if we cut down the laws to get there, if we do it in a way that deprives people of their citizenry, deprives people of their right under our laws, we give tacit approval to violence. And what is left for us except a very barren, dangerous landscape in which none of us will be able to stand upright in those winds. And remember that our founding fathers wrote our seminal documents upon which this country is founded to protect the rights of the majority and the minority. Equal justice for all. As meaningful today as it was when it was written. So this is not an argument that I'm proposing against the staging of public demonstrations or engaging in civil disobedience. That is everybody's right. All of us have ancestors, if we go far enough back, who were persecuted. All of us have had to fight for something, to right a wrong we've endured in our own life, to fight for a friend or a family member. Perhaps somebody may even have wound up in a courtroom. Peaceful demonstrations and fair process are part of our American tradition. In fact, the right to assemble peacefully and to petition the government for redress of grievances is guaranteed to us by the First Amendment. Civil disobedience also has a place in our tradition. Think of the lunch counter sit-ins during the Civil Rights era. There is, however, an important but often forgotten caveat. If your disobedience breaks the law, even the one you're trying to change, you must accept the legal consequences. Martin Luther King Jr. knew this. He abided by that principle, which is why he spent so much of his life in Southern jails. And it is important to agree. It is the essence of community. We simply can't argue about everything. But we should argue, and we should feel free to argue, about things that matter to us. Think of whom the change agents in history have been. Moses, Jesus, Newton, Einstein, Darwin, Galileo, Mandela, Gandhi, Freud, Reagan. These are people who disagreed with the status quo, people who fought for their beliefs against the traditional establishment, who fought for change and who changed the minds of people around them and changed the societies they lived in and changed the future. But imagine if they were killed the first time they uttered something disagreeable. Imagine if those voices were silenced the first time they said something that some legislature didn't agree with. How much worse will the world be? The Greeks looked at disagreement and argument as a science. Call it logic and rhetoric. To them, it was a process. Argument was a process. You start with a thesis. You then have an antithesis, an antithesis, and we come up with a synthesis, which everybody would agree is a good thing, but which cannot exist without the fight that comes before it. But it was a peaceful process. So the second piece of advice I would offer is this, and it holds true for all sides. Stop trying to destroy the person who won. I say that to the Republicans as it relates to Obama, and I say that to the Democrats as it relates to Trump. Stop trying to destroy and pull down the person who won and won fairly. If you don't like the outcome of an election, start organizing and get more votes the next time. Raise money, raise awareness, don't raise your fists, don't raise your guns. Fair elections, an adult citizenry needs to accept and deal with it again in a civil manner. And if you don't like the outcome of a court decision, support an appeal to the next judicial level. If it's something that happens in the Supreme Court that you don't like, go to your legislature. Remember, Dred Scott took only 10 years to be overturned by the Congress. And it leads to my third point, which is that in order to preserve and sustain a civil society, we must honor and protect the legal system. Criticism of the courts is legitimate. Criticism of decisions issued by judges is legitimate. And in this country, we have the right to criticize anything we want, whenever we want. But incendiary attacks designed to destroy public confidence in the judicial system must be rejected, and the attackers called to account. Because in the absence of a strong judiciary, that is the part of the government that protects us against the winds blowing from legislatures and blowing from the executive branch and blowing from wherever else it comes from. It isn't always easy, that's clear. All of us are probably a little uncomfortable with the notion and our legal principle that says that we would rather have 10 guilty men go free than have one innocent person sent to jail. And our view of the Fourth Amendment's limits on unreasonable searches and seizures will be different for all of us, whether we're talking about a violent criminal or perhaps one of our own kids with a couple of joints that was found underneath the seat of his car, who doesn't have a friend or family member who has been in that situation. But that's the point. As long as we believe the legal system is administered with justice and fairness, and that it's based on time-tested principles rather than selective case-by-case whims, then we can sustain a functioning society. So here's my bottom line, or as trial lawyers like to say, my summation. A civil society means that you follow the rules or peacefully try to change them. Things can take a lot longer that way, but taking shortcuts to get what you want, especially when it leads somebody somewhere to violence, is heading in the opposite direction from a civilized society. And it can all be reduced to 5 simple words. Patience is the new patriotism. So this has been an honor to be with you. I would like to thank everybody who organized this, and I'd be very happy to take any questions any of you may have. Sir.
It seems to me that the court system is not functioning properly. If you're rich, you'd get your trial, you'd get your protection, and if you're poor, you're put into a system that with the overworked lawyers who can't protect you. I sat on 3 juries. I saw this happen. And I think that the United States is not spending enough money on the judicial system because it's not fair.
I agree with you that if you have more money, you get a better defense. It's interesting if you look at statistics from prosecutors' offices. They win 98% of their cases against poor people and about half of their cases against rich people. So I agree with you. The way to address that is to try to improve funding, to raise awareness, to get more funding and better people into public defenders' offices. Hard to do, many ways to do it, but I agree with your observation.
I have a couple of things I'd like to mention. I'm concerned mostly about what you said about the 14th Amendment, that any person cannot be denied under our system due process of law. But the way you phrased it suggests to me that our law applies to citizens other than our own citizens in this country, and I don't see how that could be. The preamble of the Constitution mentions we the people institute the government for ourselves and our posterity. Doesn't seem to be good rationale for that. I doubt very much that been held up in court.
So I wasn't.
Has it?
I'm sorry. So just on that point, I wasn't saying, and if I did, I misspoke. I wasn't saying that our laws apply to citizens of other countries. What I was saying was that our laws and due process apply to persons.
Right, but
persons, as opposed to citizens. Not all persons have the rights of citizens. Persons who are not citizens can't vote in our elections. But if you are within our borders, you cannot be deprived of due process and certain basic rights. That's the point. Sorry, go ahead.
Has the court ever faced that issue?
Sure, and there are any number of decisions in our courts that make that point expressly. So not all rights apply to people who are not citizens, but if you are within our borders, if you are a person subject to the jurisdiction of our courts, you are still entitled to due process.
Whether you're legal or illegal?
Yes, but.
Yes.
So if you are an illegal alien, there are processes and procedures to remove you from the country. There are processes and procedures to prevent you from entering the country. All things that would not apply to U.S. citizens. But that has to be done with some sort of due process.
Okay. The second point you mentioned about the president, and this is not meant politically, arguing about judges or somehow defaming judges. Did not FDR, during that era, dislike what he called the old men of the Supreme Court and threaten to pack the court?
So the court packing efforts of Roosevelt would have been just as criticizable, if you will, and he was vehemently criticized, if you remember, and his court packing plan is one of the black marks on his administration. This was not something that he received a lot of praise for. But, you know, in a populist sense, if you will, presidents look at Congress and Congress looks at the president and they try to figure out who's boss. And depending upon what your stature is and how well you're doing, they can feel a little frothier toward one another.
Right, but my point was to say that FDR certainly is a lot better than the current president, in my view. But he was also criticized, so I don't see why, you would just criticize Trump alone. That's the point. I mean, they both did the same thing. And the last thing is, you mentioned equality under the law. I have been people in my family have been victims of the so-called affirmative action, which is essentially works out to be an inclusion by displacement. That is, in order to keep some people in, some people are displaced. I mean, there's a tremendous case about Harvard that did the same thing. They did one group here and another group there, and that was courts threw that out.
Sure. So, and our firm, for example, was involved in the University of Michigan affirmative action litigation. So, so my point on that is not to take a side on it, but to say that there's a manner to discuss your differences as strongly as people feel about these differences. The manner that we discuss them in has to be done in a civil American fashion. And for the purposes of this talk, I wouldn't care how the merit of the debate came out. You just can't kill somebody because they thought of something. You know, when you are having an argument with somebody, and you say, hold on a second, and then you go get a baseball bat and smack him in the head with it, it really doesn't matter what you are arguing about anymore, because the disagreement's not a crime, but hitting somebody in the head with a baseball bat is. So as a metaphor, we have to find ways to put down our baseball bats and talk with one another. You know, we wind up being so identified by our position that we lose the ability to understand what the other person is saying. It is very rare in my over 30 years of litigating cases to find situations where one side is 100% right and the other side's 100% wrong, because you don't tend to go to court on those cases. Usually, each side has something to say, even if it's not as full a measure as the other side. And this has to be something we talk about in a civilized debate, in a civilized society.
I would like to ask you a question about legal talent at two extremes. At one extreme, do you feel the legal profession is losing some of the best and the brightest, to Wall Street firms, to Silicon Valley, the tech firms like Google or Facebook? That's at the starting point for first-year lawyers, obviously. And then at the other extreme, the most prestigious shops considered to be, the federal district court judges, the appellate court judges, and ultimately the 9 Supreme Court justices. But when you look at the salaries, their salaries is not much different than the first-year lawyer right out of law school. And, how can you get the best and the brightest to become federal judges when you have such salary extremes?
So my answer to your first question is no. As to the question about judges' salaries, it's funny. The first job I had graduating law school was to clerk for a federal judge. I think I made $21,000 that year. And then the next year, the firm I went to raised associate salaries. And I was now making more than my federal judge was going to make that year, which is a very embarrassing, thing. And there is no question that whether it comes to judges, teachers, nurses, the jobs that support this great country, they are all underpaid. Policemen, firemen, all of these positions, our armed forces, horribly underpaid. So that is a part of a problem that we have to figure out an answer to. It's a little beyond the scope of this talk, is how do we pay people that provide that service better and provide them with the appropriate benefits. You know, there are a lot of judges, and I believe this, who when they impanel a jury, and if any of you have sat on juries, maybe you've heard this, that after military service, the greatest service that a citizen can provide to the country is jury service. Because if we can't get juries around the country to fairly decide the disputes that we have with one another, the whole system breaks down. So how we do that and how we raise these salaries are for greater minds than mine, more talented people than me.
In your enlightening presentation, you mentioned that an attorney is supposed to get the best outcome for the client. However, there are situations in which the attorneys use knowingly false information, or they use undue influence with other attorneys because of their influence or whatever. So what is the recourse? Shouldn't, when a case like this is brought up, shouldn't these attorneys be severely punished? Because the system of justice would suffer tremendously when this kind of inequities occur.
Well, if you think of it like sports, you know, you compete as hard as you can, you just can't cheat. So private attorneys in private cases fight as hard as they can within the rules that they're allowed and with the tools that they have. And their job is to win. There's no question about that. But you can't cheat. You can't falsify a document, you can't forge things, you can't lie about things. That's breaking the rules. So anytime you break the rules, there should be severe consequences for it, particularly for lawyers who are supposed to have a special relationship of trust with the court. We call lawyers court officers for that specific reason. So, we fight hard, but we fight fairly. And if we cheat, bad things should happen to us.
Rich, two questions. Just going back to the Simpson trial, which I'm sure nearly everybody in the room remembers, O.J. really had a blue ribbon panel of lawyers that were set up for him, and they were against local prosecutors who were not part of the blue ribbon panel and weren't making big bucks. Obviously, O.J. was found not guilty. And I remember at the end of that, a law enforcement official was asked, "What are you going to do?" And he said, "Well, all the evidence points to O.J. There's nothing to do." So my point is that blue ribbon panel helped get O.J. off. So is that fair, is my first question. The second question is, and maybe O.J. was not guilty, I don't know. I wasn't there. But the second question is, this whole issue with the police and St. Louis and the places where the riots are taking place, how do you see the judicial side of America playing a role there and bringing us all into a more rational spot?
So as to the first question, you know, there's a terrible saying that has truth to it. You get the justice that you pay for. And not, you know, some people use that in the sense of payments to influence judges, and to be sure, our history is not free from that. But it goes a little bit, I think, to the gentleman's question earlier. about does the system work perfectly? No. And if you look at prosecutors' winning rates, they go down dramatically when you have defendants that have the ability to pay more. So, so it's not fair. And, aspirationally, we would try to do better. But this is the reality of the system we live in. It is better than any other system. We're stuck with the flaws that are endemic to it. And you will get better justice if you can pay for better lawyers. You will get more influence in Congress, the more money you have to spend for that influence, and you will buy a better dinner if you can afford a better restaurant. So I don't think there's any way around the human reality of that. So I think that's what I would say about your first comment, first question. The second one, this is the thicket of thorns in our society in many ways, because it is very hard to be a police officer. That is got to be the hardest job in America, unless you are literally a fireman in a fire. But boy, policing our streets is tough, especially in places like Ferguson. And you don't have the luxury of making perfect decisions with a lot of time to make those decisions. And so we try to have rules that apply to police that are reasonable, and terms of engagement for those police that are reasonable, that first and foremost don't put them at risk for doing their job. And speaking for myself, we should always err on the side of making sure that our law enforcement officers are not at undue risk for doing their job. There's a section of the U.S. Code called Section 1983 that deals with the excessive force, to shorten it up, the excessive force of police officers acting under the color of state law, meaning doing their jobs as police officers. And the first case that I had when I was clerking for this federal judge involved took place in Albany. Call goes out to the cops that a church was just vandalized, and they were looking for a young black guy. And this was they were patrolling a neighborhood in Albany that was an all-white neighborhood, except for one black family, who happened to be the priest of that church. And as they were getting out of their car, the cops swarmed them, and, long story short, beat the crap out of the whole family. And they were saying, "We live here. This is my house." "Sure it is." So how did that case go down? And that's a situation where police have the time, they can figure it out, take the driver's license, take a look at the address you're out, and not too hard to figure that out. You're not under a lot of threat from people just for church. Very different when somebody is racing at you who's hopped up on meth, and you've got maybe a second and a half to decide, is that a gun in his hand or is it a wrench? Or, and the juries have come out largely in favor of the police officers, and largely because we protect our police officers from having to make split-second decisions. And so people have to protest non-violently, is my answer to that. You can walk the streets, and you can protest, and you can get a license. You can't rush police officers. That's a bad way to protest. It's an illegal way to protest. So we should require people to protest legally, and things will be better. And I think that judges should enforce all of it. But we need to send two messages. We're not going to tolerate police brutality. We're not going to tolerate racism in the enforcement of laws. And we are similarly not going to tolerate threats against law enforcement. And we have to find a way to balance that. And courts are stuck in the middle of it, and they make their decisions, you know, one case at a time. It's a little bit the problem with court decisions, right? Because we make them one case at a time based on those specific facts and circumstances, and we don't, as lawyers or judges, get a chance to legislate and get a chance to say, let's fix our society. That's for our elected officials. I hope that's somewhat addressing it.
So we have time for one more question? We have one more question? Not? Yes?
Lately, PBS has had a series on the Vietnam years, and it's terrific if you haven't seen it. It really gets you right back to those days. And one of the themes that I've picked up from it is how divided the country was. And more recently, with the NFL and Trump tweeting and so on, I feel tremendous division, and I'm just curious, where do you think this is all going to end up?
So, you know, it's a great question. So, in the Vietnam era, the conservatives hated the liberal demonstrations. And today, the liberals hate the conservative demonstrations. And I think that what it shows us in this country is that we will have peaks and valleys for everybody. We can survive very well in this country with a Democratic administration, with a Republican administration, with a conservative administration, a liberal administration, and we have. What we can't survive are people who shoot each other when they disagree with you. That's what we can't survive. So I am one of a number of people who have had the good fortune to stand at this lectern and address those questions in various ways. But from my perspective, I have a lot of confidence in America. We have been through lots of these ups and downs before. And if we allow ourselves to keep our heads, if cooler heads prevail, I think we will come out of these things fine. The problem is you can make a terrible miscalculation, and then things can go badly. You know, wars are usually started that way. We have one brewing in North Korea, which is troubling. I started our firm's office in South Korea, so I've been in Seoul maybe 40 times in the last 8 or 9 years. And I'll tell you, it's a lot like being in Israel, because the local population is so numb to the threat that they live in because they have no place to go. So the only downside to a catastrophic war with North Korea is that you'll have about 10 million South Koreans killed at the same time. Not going to bother, you know, I mean, I don't say this glibly, but no bombs are falling on American soil if we have a war with North Korea. But you have to be careful. You know, I would say in something like that, well, you know, look, cooler heads will prevail. People will step back. You know, all this will not wind up with a hot war on the Korean Peninsula because there's too many actors that don't want that to happen, but it might. You wind up in this country, are we going to wind up with a tyrannical government? I don't think so. But you do have to be careful. The rights we have, the God-given rights that we have, I think we have an obligation to protect them. I think we have an obligation to do it ourselves.
Thank you, Rich, for a very inspiring, thought-provoking talk tonight. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We look forward to seeing you October 23rd. We have Civility and Education. Jonathan Starr will talk about running an American school in a foreign country. We'll see you then.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate it.
Really.